Amen. Well, indeed, open your Bibles to Ecclesiastes chapter 12. And as you know, we won't have any discussion groups this evening as it is the 8 o'clock hour, and we had wonderful time around the tables already and enjoying that food. But having me preaching as the final thing of the evening can sometimes be a little bit dangerous because we could just keep this thing going. But the good thing is I'm still dealing with jet lag, and so going past 9 o'clock would not be that easy for me. But I'm delighted to be here and delighted to open this text for you this evening, Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verses 1 to 8. And the title of this sermon from Ecclesiastes is The Duty of Young Men. The duty of young men. I want to address this directly to the young men in our midst. And you might say, well, who are these young men? Well, when we get into the text, you'll be able to identify yourself quite quickly, because as we get into this very memorable text, there are a lot of analogies and pictures that Solomon gives us that describe older life. And if you haven't experienced any of the things that we will be talking about, well, then this text, in a very special way, direct way, applies to you. I do want to particularly exhort the young men tonight. But this is not just for young men. As we will see, the counsel, especially in verse 1, that Solomon provides is always for all of us. Let me read this text for you. Ecclesiastes chapter 12, beginning in verse 1. Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come and the years draw near, when you will say, I have no delight in them. Before the sun and the light, the moon and the stars are darkened, and clouds return after the rain. In the day that the watchmen of the house tremble and mighty men stoop, the grinding ones stand idle because they are few, and those who look through the windows grow dim. And the doors on the street are shut as the sound of the grinding mill is low, and one will arise at the sound of the bird, and all the daughters of song will sing softly. Furthermore, men are afraid of a high place and of terrors on the road. The almond tree blossoms, the grasshopper drags himself along, the caperberry is ineffective. For man goes to his eternal home while mourners go about in the street. Remember him before the silver cord is broken and the golden bowl is crushed. The pitcher by the well is shattered, and the wheel at the cistern is crushed. Then the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. All is vanity. Now, when we look at this text, particularly the exhortation that begins, we see that Solomon is addressing young men, and when we think of even the title, The Duty of Young Men, probably your thoughts go back to a work published some time ago by J.C. Ryle, back in 1865, some 150 plus years ago. He wrote a very important book, and I would commend it to any man, especially young men, and it's called Thoughts for Young Men. In fact, even in that book, Ryle makes regular references to the book of Ecclesiastes, but I want to read a few words from the introduction to this classic little book by J.C. Ryle. Ryle says this as he begins this book, Thoughts for Young Men. He says, I speak without respect of persons. I say it of all, rich or poor, gentle or rough, educated or uneducated, in the city or in the country, it makes no difference. I shudder to think how few young men are led by the Spirit, how few are on that narrow road which leads to life, how few are setting their affections on things above, how few are taking up the cross and following Christ. I say all this with sorrow, but I believe in God's sight that I am saying nothing more than the truth." He goes on and says the following. He says, "Young men, you form a large and most important class in the population of this country. But where and in what condition are your souls? Regardless of where we turn for an answer, the report will be one and the same. Let us ask any faithful minister of the gospel and note what he will tell us. How many unmarried young people can he remember who come to the Lord's Supper? Who are the most backward about the doctrines of salvation, the most irregular about Sunday services, the most difficult to draw to weekly Bible studies and prayer meetings, the most inattentive to whatever is being preached? Which part of his congregation fills him with the most anxiety? Who in his flock are the hardest to manage? Who require the most frequent warnings and rebukes? Who cause him the greatest uneasiness and sorrow? Who keep him most constantly in fear for their souls and seem the most hopeless? Depend on it, his answer will always be the young men." End quote. Young men are endued with unusual strength and vitality. They have that resilience and determination. They have the ability, unlike any others, to be knocked down and jump right back up again and go, and yet so many squander these resources on that which is hollow and harmful. Like Esau, so many young men are willing to sell out their futures for the sake of some temporary gratification in the present moment. Indeed, what J.C. Ryle noted is true of our day as well. Those who cause us the most concern are the young men, those endowed with the greatest resources, the greatest opportunities, the greatest potential are also those who, for various reasons, are only too willing to sell out. Now, J.C. Ryle wasn't the first to notice. As we already read in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, Solomon as well leaves it to the end where he, in very particular words, addresses the young men. And he gives in very clear details their singular duty, what is most important for them. And this is crucial because in this book of Ecclesiastes, where Solomon has so frequently pressed upon us the brevity of life, the inevitability of death, and that it comes far quicker than we ever care to acknowledge, the presence of adversity and the likelihood of experiences of injustice, Solomon has pressed this upon us over and over, and he's told us of his own story to try to understand these things, to come up with all the solutions, and how that drove him almost mad. He sought answers in all the wrong places for a period of time in his life. And he tells us that story, especially in the opening chapters, of so many failures as he sought to understand the enigmas of life. He has communicated this to us over and over and over again, while he's also communicated all of these wonderful carpe diem texts. Seize the day, steward the things God has given, make most, run hard in life. And so as he comes to the end, he focuses on an audience that has the most to gain from the lessons that he has outlined in this book, and it's the young men. If there's any category, if there's any demographic that can make the most of the book of Ecclesiastes and all that Solomon has sought to emphasize, it's the young men. They have their lives, however brief, still fully in front of them. And if they are to ingest these truths, if they are to accept them, and by God's grace apply them to life, they are the ones who will most benefit in the long term. from what Solomon has taught. And so he comes to address the young men. And he gives them a duty, and it's expressed for us, first of all, in the first half of chapter 12, verse 1, and we'll call this the duty declared. The duty declared. Notice what Solomon says. He says in verse 1, remember also your Creator in the days of your youth. Remember also. That little word also indicates that this really is following up on some previous exhortations. And we noticed this already at the end of chapter 11, a chapter that teaches both old men and young men how to smile in the face of adversity. In the final closing verses of that chapter, Solomon already began his turn toward young men. And we saw this last time when we were in chapter 11, that Solomon gives to these young men three exhortations that we summarized as this: rejoice, run after, and renounce. Notice verses 9 and 10 of chapter 11. Solomon there already began addressing the young men, and he said this: rejoice, young man, during your childhood, and let your heart be pleasant during the days of your young manhood, and follow or run hard after the impulses of your heart and the desires of your eyes, yet know that God will bring you to judgment for all of these things. So remove, or you could say renounce, grief and anger from your heart, and put away pain from your body, because childhood and the prime of life are fleeting. Solomon's charge there to the young men is so critical, because he says, you know what, there are going to be plenty of opportunities in your life, or I should say plenty of temptations in your life, to become bitter, to become resentful, to become cynical when you endure the adversities of life. And it's going to be your response, your tendency to respond with grief and anger, with vexation. Solomon says already there, put those away, renounce those things, and instead rejoice. And now as he begins chapter 12, he focuses on one crucial discipline, that of remembering. Now, this charge to remember is not some simplistic calling to mind on every so often on an occasion when you remember something, but this kind of remembrance that Solomon places as the duty of all young men is an active, intentional concentration. It is a focus of the mind. It is directing the mind in response to something in a certain way, so that, as one writer said, it shapes one's perspective on the present. One commentator put it this way: to remember him is no perfunctory or purely mental act. It is to drop our pretense of self-sufficiency and commit ourselves to him. At its best and strongest, remembrance can be a matter of passionate fidelity. When remembering means as much as this, there can be no half measures or temporizing. Youth and the whole span of life are not too much to pour into it. This is the discipline that Solomon lays down in front of young men. It means to renounce that self-sufficiency and commit. And to what or to whom are we to commit? Notice what he says. He doesn't say, remember your impending death. He doesn't even say, remember the likelihood of adversity. No, by this time in the book, Solomon has sufficiently pressed upon us the reality of those things, the reality of life outside the Garden of Paradise, the reality of life in a world that has been cursed because of sin. But here, he points to the ultimate. He says, remember your Creator. And the title here is very important. He could have said, remember God, but he says, remember your Creator. That's not a coincidence. In fact, it draws our attention back to previous texts in the book of Ecclesiastes, which emphasize different qualities about God, particularly in his work, his sovereign work of creation. And these are the things in particular, though it's not limited to these are the things in particular that must be concentrated upon, that must serve as the focus of a young man's daily living. He gives us several of these when we look back. In fact, there's 4 texts that describe the work of God in creation in the book of Ecclesiastes. The first one is in Ecclesiastes 3, verse 11. Back in chapter 3, verse 11, Solomon said this, he, that is God, has made everything. There is the emphasis on his creation. He has made everything appropriate in its time. He has also set eternity in their heart, in men's hearts, yet so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning even to the end. And the emphasis here is on God's sovereignty, particularly as it relates to his inscrutable wisdom. When we remember our Creator, we remember that he is sovereign, and that sovereignty is inscrutably wise. There's nothing of foolishness in what he makes, nothing of stupidity in what he ordains. He is inscrutably wise. And this is a key lesson for young men to understand. It's their duty to reflect upon this as a regular habit of life. Secondly, Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verses 13 to 14. Here again, we find Solomon pointing to and describing God's creative activity. Consider the work of God. For who is able to straighten what he has bent? In the day of prosperity, be happy. But in the day of adversity, consider God has made the one as well as the other, so that man will not discover anything that will be after him. Here, the emphasis is on God's exhaustive sovereignty, that it's absolute, that there is nothing that falls outside of that sovereign plan and God's decree. It is all part of what he has ordained. And again, when Solomon calls upon young men to remember their Creator, it is that they remember this, that anything that comes across your path from this day forward, anything that has come across your path in days past, nothing is blind fate. Nothing is by accident. Instead, it is the plan of God. He is absolutely sovereign over the most meticulous details. And Solomon says, young men, this is key to your life. This is key to your mental health. This is key to your success in living, is to understand this about your Creator. Number 3, Ecclesiastes 7, verse 29. Solomon there said, behold, I have found only this, that God made men upright, but they have sought out many devices. Now, when we talk about God's meticulous and absolute sovereignty, the response sometimes is, well, does that make God the author of sin, the author of moral evil? And the answer that we find in Ecclesiastes 7, verse 29 is absolutely not. What God makes And what he continues to bring into your lives today is good. He is a benevolent, righteous God, and his sovereignty is impeccably righteous. It's so important to remember this too, young man, that you cannot look at the adversities that you have in life, whether that be a problem that you have with a career, a job, education, a family. Maybe you're newly married and you're saying, why did God give me this woman? Or why did God give me this family? Why did God give me this illness? Why did God give me this boss? When Solomon emphasizes God's creative work, he emphasizes that there is no way that you can question its purity. He is impeccably righteous. And then fourth, Solomon has said in Ecclesiastes in chapter 11, verse 5, the following: just as you do not know the path of the wind and how bones are formed in the womb of the pregnant woman, so you do not know the activity of God who makes all things. This last one in particular humbles us. His sovereignty, particularly in what he creates and makes, whether at a universal level or whether individually in the nitty-gritty details of our lives, it is inexplicably mysterious. That it's not our job to be able to answer and explain it all. It's not within our ability to understand how point A relates to point B. And though these circumstances of adversity and difficulty may seem to us to be wasted energy or wasted opportunity or what have you, we must always remember that we see such a tiny little perspective, and that what is most important is that God sees it all and he understands it, but to us it's a mystery. And that brings both humility and faith. And so here is the fundamental truth that arises out of that. It's this: there is a personal, all-powerful, all-wise, never-erring, transcendent God who brought you, young man, into existence and to whom you are ultimately accountable. You are not the master of your fate. You are a creature. You are not self-sufficient. You are made out of the dust, formed in the womb. You're entirely dependent. You are not free from responsibility to gallivant however you may like. No, you will give an account. And it's not yours to demand an answer. It's yours to give one when you stand before this Creator. This, Solomon says, is what you must remember. And this changes everything. It's to remember what you have so often declared throughout Scripture, such as in Isaiah 45, verse 18. For thus says the Lord who created the heavens, He is God who formed the earth and made it. He established it. He did not create it a waste place, but formed it to be inhabited. He says, I am Yahweh, and there is no one else. Those words are both frightening and inviting. That He has communicated to us, that He has revealed Himself to us is inviting. He says to us, I am the Lord, there is no other. And yet it's frightening because when He says, I am the Lord, there is no other, that means for each one of us, there is a judge. There is one before whom we will stand, one before whom we will give an account. And Solomon here says, young man, remember. Remember. The French philosopher Jacques Ellul, though he said a lot of things wrong, said this right. He said, you may consider yourself autonomous, but you are incapable of knowing what should be done, incapable of knowing what wisdom is. You are a creature. All the evils, and I choose my words carefully, all the evils of the world stem from our taking ourselves to be the creator, end quote. And that is indeed a problem of young men, just as J.C. Ryle said. And it's a problem that each young man must come to terms with and recognize that his duty on earth in this brief life is to remember his Creator. And notice how Solomon expresses this. Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth. What he is saying here is so important because it's so common for young men to think, I've got all my life ahead of me. I will think of my Creator later. Maybe when I get a family someday and start having children. How many young men only start to think about these things when they bring a little baby into the world? Or they think, I've got so much ahead of me, all my good energetic years, I'll think of my Creator in my retirement. When I'm done with my career and I've made my millions, then I will think of Him. And there are even those who say, I will think of Him when I'm on my deathbed. When the doctor gives me 2 months to live, that's when I will think of Him. But Solomon says, no, do not put it off. You are to remember Him in the days of your youth, at the very beginning of your existence. This is your greatest duty. And why is it so important to do this now when you're young? And if we would summarize the book of Ecclesiastes, I think you'd come up with 2 very important reasons. Number 1, so that you do not miss out on all the true joy that you can have in this life that is outside of the garden. And you might say, well, wait a minute. If I pursue money and women, if I pursue pleasure, if I pursue my own career and all my own things, is that not going to give me pleasure? And the answer to that, as we've seen over and over again in Ecclesiastes, is absolutely not. No joy there. As Solomon has emphasized to us over and over, is that so long as you pursue joy merely for joy, so long as you pursue pleasure merely for pleasure, you will not find it, never. But pursue God. Remember your Creator, and that's when you will find joy. Remember your Creator, and that's when all of a sudden the simple things of life are all transformed. Fear God, and all of a sudden, all those things of life, eating and friendship and a wife and work, all of those things are redeemed. And now you can experience true joy. And Solomon, on behalf of young men, the young men he is writing to, wants them to experience joy. And so he gives them the very best advice. You want joy in this life. You want fulfillment. You want to make it through the adversities. You want to know peace. This is how you do it. Run hard after God, and all these things will be added unto you. But secondly, he says this also so as not to increase or intensify the adversities of life that do come. Because here's the problem. Young men may think the adversities are in later life, but if they don't get the foundation right, if they don't fear God from the beginning, if they don't remember Him, as Solomon says here, then the adversities of life are not merely difficulties along the way. They become the source of resentment. They become the source of bitterness and cynicism. If you don't fulfill your duty if you don't remember your Creator. As you grow older, each passing year makes you more and more of a problem. Each passing year makes you bitter, makes you one of those grumpy old men. And we all know of those grumpy old men, and they're grumpy old men not by accident. There has been a whole life that has preceded that grumpiness that is at the very antithesis of what Solomon declares here. Those are the men, those grumpy old men, bitter, cynical, unable to fellowship, always angry, always pointing out others' faults. They are the men who did not remember the Creator in the days of their youth. As one commentator said, Ecclesiastes 12, verse 1, this exhortation, this duty declared, is a warning against mindless self-indulgence and profligacy during the days of one's vigor. To forget the Creator of youth is to invite bitter regrets and an empty existence in old age. To remember the Creator is to follow the path of wisdom and extend the joy of life. That's the duty declared. Now we get to the urgency expressed. Solomon is moved by a sense of urgency. The clock is ticking. Time is of the essence. The sands of time are sinking and sinking. So in verses 1 through the end of verse 7, Solomon weaves together a very memorable, in fact, a very famous poetic expression here in Ecclesiastes 12. We've read it already, but what is important to note is that this is the continuation of one long sentence. Solomon doesn't want to stop. After he's given the duty and has commanded young men to keep it, he then turns to the urgency and lists one feature after another in this poetry, reminding us of the urgency to seize the day. And it's marked off by a series of prepositions before. 3 times, and they're very strategically placed. Before. Let's look at them quickly. The first one begins the second half of verse 1. Solomon says, remember your Creator before the evil days come and the years draw near when you will say, I have no delight in them. This is his first argument for urgency. It's a general reference to the reality that as time passes, increased vexation comes. As you get older, especially as you get past that tipping point, vexation, problems, adversities increase. When he refers to evil days here, it's not a reference to moral evil, but as Solomon has done throughout this book, evil days refers to tragedies and pains and adversities. It refers to bent circumstances. And Solomon is saying that as the longer that you live, these bent circumstances accumulate. Not only do they accumulate in your memory, but they also accumulate in the living of life. The older that you get, the more you feel them. You can't bounce back like you used to. He said this back in chapter 11, verse 8, as he addressed old men, he said, indeed, if a man should live many years, let him rejoice in them all, and let him remember the days of darkness. For they will be many. Everything that is to come will be futility. And that leads one man to say this, that reality, that inside every old person is a young person wondering what happened. And I'm at that stage already thinking, how did I get here so fast? Amen. Are you saying that about me? Or now I might take offense at that, but here's the principle that arises from that that half verse there in verse 1. The evil days that come. Here it is. Without a proper orientation toward the Creator that is to be established in the early years of life, the accumulated experiences of adversity will lead you toward increasing bitterness. That's always what happens. You can guarantee on it. You can go to the bank on this. Unless you have the right orientation early on, the likelihood is, without some kind of dramatic change in your direction, you will become increasingly bitter because you will become increasingly aware of these adversities. And you will lack the framework to process it. And that's what leads to grumpy old men. But Solomon continues now in verses 2 to 6. He has another before statement, or verses 2 to 5, I should say. And here in verses 2 to 5, you have a very interesting series of metaphors. It's what attracts a lot of attention among interpreters. And as he gives these metaphors, as we're going to go through them, you probably already noticed it when we read, but it's not that we are to find exact equivalency here with the pictures that Solomon paints and the experiences of older life. But there are certainly genuine, general similarities, thought-provoking similarities between these things. He says in verse 2, before the sun and the light, the moon and the stars are darkened, and clouds return after the rain. Remember your Creator. What's he referring to? It's a meteorological analogy. And we know as we think of light and we think of storm clouds that the general pattern is that after the storm comes and blocks out the sun, those clouds dissipate and the sun returns. But as you get older, if you equate this to aging, those clouds don't break up like they once used to. Your faculties are clouded and remain clouded. As the body grows older, Solomon says, one's senses and faculties become increasingly clouded and dull. It's not like it used to be. It's not like that storm that quickly moves through and sun returns. No, it's not like that in our bodies. As we get older, it used to be we might get ill, we might get sick, we might get some kind of virus, and we jump right back up, and the light comes back. But as you get older, it takes longer and longer to get back to that stage, and then all of a sudden you get to a point in your life when the clouds just don't dissipate. The faculties, the senses are always now cloudy. He then continues with another analogy here in verses 3 to 5, one that he takes not from the heavens, but now he takes it from domestic life. And there's fascinating pictures here of how Solomon describes getting older. He begins by referring to the watchmen of the house which tremble. Now, the watchmen of the house are the arms, the strong muscles. And they used to be strong, but Solomon says now they tremble. You can't hold up things like you used to. The muscles are not there. They've somehow sunken, fallen. The watchmen tremble. He says the mighty men stoop. Those are the legs. And those strong, straight, muscular legs now begin to bend and bow. They lose that muscular form. The legs begin to stoop. He refers to the grinding ones that stand idle because they are few. We know what that refers to, the teeth. You start to lose them. And as you lose your teeth, you lose that ability to enjoy a good steak. And so you begin to not eat as much because the teeth are few. The grinding ones, therefore, stand idle. He refers to those who look out. Those who look through windows grow dim. It's our eyes, the windows to the soul. And all of a sudden, you can't see like you used to. And they didn't have glasses back then. And so after a while, they could hardly make out people's faces. Those who look through the windows grow dim. He's going through the senses, all of these senses that are challenged and clouded due to old age. He refers to the doors on the street that are shut as the sound of the grinding mill is low, referring to the ears. It's as if they're stopped up, and yet nothing is there. Why can't I hear anymore? You can't even hear that grinding mill. It's now just a low buzz. He refers to one who arises at the sound of a bird, referring to the problem of never being able again to enjoy a deep sleep. The problem of insomnia. And it's something that young men say, man, I can deal with 2-4 hours of sleep and I'm good. I don't know why these guys need to sleep so much. And then you get older and you wish you could sleep for 6 hours straight. You can't. And that little tiny bird, even though you can't hear the grinding mill, for some reason, that little tiny bird in the tree outside in the backyard is chirping before the sun even peeks out, and you hear it, and you can't sleep. I'm not speaking from experience, I don't think, but it refers to the daughters of song singing softly, referring to the inability now to enjoy the nuances of life. Your senses don't pick up on it anymore. You used to be able to listen to a symphony and catch all of those musical notations and instruments, and now when you hear it, it's not there. It continues in verse 5 and says, furthermore, men are afraid of the high places and of terrors on the road. You got to get rid of the stairs in the house, right? No more climbing on the roof. There's a fear. In fact, what Solomon is referring to here is something that's very, very difficult, which explains why old men still want to get on roofs, because that fear represents a loss of manliness. To be manly means you don't fear, but now there's a fear of heights, a fear of falling. And even being in a crowded room is something of fear because you can't get bumped. And if you do, you could fall over. You could get hurt. He speaks of the almond tree that blossoms. The almond tree, as we know, blossoms without the leaves. And so there's a thinningness there, referring to the color of the hair. He also refers to the grasshopper that drags himself along, the shuffling of the old man. He can no longer lift up his feet and prance like he used to. Instead, he shuffles. And then you have the reference to the caperberry, which is ineffective. A very interesting analogy. It is suggested that the caperberry was taken as a kind of stimulus for appetite as well as an aphrodisiac. And so many commentators believe this is a reference that all older men understand the problem when sexual impotency sets in. All of these different pictures of growing old in age. And then he says at the end of verse 5, for man goes to his eternal home while mourners go about in the street. Now this all comes to its conclusion with the funeral. All comes with the final destination, which is the grave. And Solomon's point here in verse 5 to speak of that eternal home is not to give us an expansive understanding of the afterlife. Instead, he is referring to the climax, the end of life under the sun. He's referring to what happens to our bodies. Genesis 3, verse 19. From the dust you are taken, and for you are dust, and to dust you will return. There's an uncanny resemblance or idea behind the death that comes as a result of the curse, as it was God himself who pronounced that curse upon Adam and all his progeny, for the wages of sin is death, right? There's an uncanny resemblance here that just as God has formed every person in old age and in death, as Gibson says, every person is unmade, so to speak. The body deteriorates and turns into the very dust that formed it. And this brings us to life principle 2. Without a proper orientation toward the Creator, established in the early years of life, you will squander the opportunities he gives to enjoy the simple things of life to the fullest. Because here's the thing, young man, you may think that you have time. You may think that you may even have a decade. And Solomon is saying, you know what? By the time that decade is over, you will not be able to enjoy the things that God has given. It'll be taken away. Now is the time. There's a third before then that comes in verse 6 that introduces the last set of metaphors that communicate urgency. In verse 6, Solomon says, remember him. It's really a continuation of this one long sentence that has begun in verse 1. Solomon says, remember him before the silver cord is broken and the gold bowl is crushed. The pitcher by the well is shattered and the wheel at the cistern is crushed. What he's referring to here are utensils that were very important in the daily living in those days. The golden bowl is crushed when that silver cord is broken. And the idea there, although we're not quite sure on this one, is that it refers to a lamp that is placed in a gold bowl with the oil and a wick in it, and it's held up to the lampstand by some kind of silver chain. But when that chain is cut, that golden bowl crashes to the ground, rendering the whole bowl and the lamp useless. A reference to the pitcher by the well. That's that bowl lowered down into the well and brought back up with water. But once it's shattered, it has absolutely no use. He refers to the wheel at the cistern, referring to the pulley that you need in order to be able to let down that pitcher into the well. And when that pulley is broken, it's all over. You can't get anything out. So as Derek Kidner says, the pictures of verse 6 capture both the beauty and fragility of the human frame. A masterpiece as delicately wrought as any work of art, yet as breakable as a piece of earthenware and as useless in the end as a broken wheel. That's our bodies. That's what happens to us. And so Solomon is saying to young men, why would you wait? He goes on to say this in verse 7. He says, then the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. Solomon concludes with a direct reference to dust and to spirit. And this takes us back to both the creation of man and the fall of man. Genesis 2, verse 7, then the Lord God formed man of the dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. But then in 3:19, God curses Adam for his sin and says, by the sweat of your face you will eat bread till you return to the ground, because from it you are taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. And when Solomon gets here, and we're going to see this especially in next week's conclusion, what Solomon is getting at here when he refers to the body going to the dust, and he refers to the spirit returning to God, is he's saying, get ready for judgment. Get ready to stand before that Creator. Know, he says, that God will bring you to judgment for all of these things. Or verse 14 of this chapter, as we will study next week, God will bring every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it is good or evil. And so this leads to life principle number 3. Without a proper orientation toward the Creator, established in the early years of life, you may stand before him at judgment with great shame and regret. Solomon is pleading with the young men to understand this. This is not a game. You will stand in judgment. He wants young men to get the point. And so he's pleading, he is begging you, young man, to remember your Creator in the days of your youth. Well, very quickly, there's a final statement that closes this section in verse 8. We'll call it the rationale restated because Solomon has already said this, and we don't need to spend a lot of time on it. In verse 8, he says this, "Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, all is vanity." Solomon now returns full circle to the very start of the body of this book. In verse 1, you had an introduction to the author. You had an introduction to who he was. But in verse 2, Solomon begins his work. And in verse 2, he said this, "Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity." So he now, at this particular section in the book, closes it off. He will yet have a formal conclusion, but this is the end of the main portion of his work. And it's the same message that he said when he began. Now, it's important very quickly, as we've studied already, to understand correctly what this means. It's translated in our Bible as vanity of vanities, the word hebel, the Hebrew word hebel. Literally, the term means a puff of air, a breath, a vapor, a mist that dissipates quickly. We could see that usage in Job 7:16 and Psalm 39:5 and Psalm 114:4. And in our translation, and I would say unfortunately, translates it as vanity, suggesting that Solomon is saying, life is meaningless. Life is meaningless. All is meaningless. But that's not what Solomon is really saying, is it? We've looked at this already. He's not saying that life is meaningless. No, there is meaning when one fears God, when one remembers his Creator. What he is saying here is that life is fleeting. And this is so important. We have very short lives. And I can guarantee you that when any of us come to that moment when we say goodbye, it'll always come much quicker than we ever thought. And so Solomon again is pleading with us, all of us, to remember life's brevity and to focus on those things which really matter. Coming back to J.C. Ryle and that book, Thoughts for Young Men, there's a lot that I could quote from, but I want to quote from this section before we make some final points of application. This is what Ryle says. He says, "Tomorrow is the devil's day, but today is God's. Satan does not care how spiritual your intentions are or how holy your resolutions, if only they are determined to be done tomorrow. Young men, your time is short. Your days are but a brief shadow, a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes, a story that is soon told. Your bodies are not made of brass. There is but a step between any one of you and death. This night your soul might be required of you. You are fast going the way of all the earth. You soon will be gone. Your life is all uncertainty. Your death and judgment are perfectly sure." That's what Solomon has said in Ecclesiastes chapter 12. And so we must get right with God. And so finally, just a few key points of application here. Number one, remember this: you won't live forever. Count on the fact that old age and decline will arrive much sooner than you think. It's that kind of thinking that we must have. It's the realization that I am not going to last forever, so why spend my time trifling away in things that don't matter? Why waste my best years playing with the world when I could dedicate it to something that has eternal significance? Why would I run after meaningless pleasures when I could know my Creator? Secondly, a life of fellowship with the Creator is not something to start at retirement or on one's deathbed, but it's important to start it at the beginning of life. And young man, I plead with you, do not put this off. The best takeaway would be for you this very day, this very evening, to get right with your Creator in such a way that it transforms and changes the whole path of your life. And I can guarantee you this, you will not regret it. It's not something to put off. Your best years must be dedicated to the one who created you. Number 3, old age will be the sum of the investments that you make now. Each day you're building something, and the question is, what is it? Young man, middle-aged man, what are you building in your life? Your final years will be the sum of that investment. One writer puts it this way: old age is the harvest of all the years that have gone before. It is the barn into which all the sheaves are gathered. It is the sea into which all the rills and rivers of life flow from their springs in the hills and the valleys of your youth and manhood. We are each in our early years building the house in which we shall have to live when we grow old, and we may make it a prison or a palace. So the key question becomes, how can we live life, the writer says, how can we live life that in our old age, when it comes, shall be one of beauty and happiness? Think of that. Number 4, this command to remember is an invitation. It means there's hope. And for a moment, I want to also address the older men here. That if you are here and you're listening, there's no need for which you simply to dismiss your life now as forever meaningless. Perhaps you have squandered it. Perhaps you're living in that life that isn't much of a palace and is more like a prison. I would say this still: remember your Creator. That is hope. Remember your Creator. Remember that you will stand before Him, and that so long as you have life, so long as you still have the ability to hear and to read and to pray, the Lord is ever near to give you grace in the moment of need and to transform the days or weeks or months that you still have remaining. The responsibility that you have is not just to shrug your shoulders and say, well, that's just fate for me. No, instead, the command is for you as well. Remember your Creator. You're closer to seeing Him than ever before. And of course, ultimately, we can be thankful. Ecclesiastes is not the entire story. There is more that comes. And particularly, there is the story, there is the truth, the history of that man, Jesus Christ, who came to this earth to redeem those who have squandered their lives. He came specifically for them, not for the righteous, not for the healthy, but for those who live in a pig pen. And He came to redeem them regardless of age. He came to live that perfect life which they failed to live, and to die for sin which they had accumulated, so that they could have His life, and that this life need not be the final statement, but rather that the best life is the one yet to come. And if you haven't trusted in that Jesus Christ, let me tell you that anything that you do in this life will not be enough. You will not find satisfaction. You will not find significance. And that day when it comes, when you stand before the Creator, if you reject the gospel message, there will be no good words that you hear. You will be righteously condemned by that Creator, that sovereign one. You will be righteously condemned for an eternity in hell, paying for those sins. But all it takes is to run to Jesus Christ now, today, while it is still called today, for that redemption. And he says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Let's pray. Father, I know that there are young men here today, and young men who will hear this sermon in the future, who are squandering their lives. And I ask that you would have mercy on them. Open their eyes to see the foolishness of their ways. Give them the heart to believe. Turn their thoughts to you and make Jesus Christ beautiful in their eyes. I pray for those young men who know this message, who know the way of redemption, and yet who may be weak, faltering, tempted by some of the things in this world. Give them strength. Use these words of Solomon to give them that resolve that young men have, that young men are to show, that resolve to press forward, to keep fearing, to keep remembering. I pray for the older men here who look back on life with many regrets, who see what they've done, building on a foundation not of remembering you, but living for self. Remove that self-sufficiency from them. Give them the stamina, the ability to cry out with a full throat for mercy from you. And then I pray for those other old men in our group, in our midst, who have followed this divine advice. Lift them up and make them examples for us to follow. We need them. Use them to encourage us and to exhort us, follow in their line. We ask this all in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.